And I'd like to welcome everyone and greet everyone with the greeting of Islam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And today, inshallah, we have a very special talk on week 17. How can we know the purpose of our life? And we, inshallah, hope to be a very delightful night. And also, we're going to open the floor for, we have questions that people submitted. We're going to have time for those questions, inshallah, to be answered. And also, you can submit your questions. You can send them and put them in the chat. Today we have a very special brother. His name is Brother Abdullah Al Andalusi, and all the way from England. And inshallah, today he will cover this topic of how we can know the purpose of life. Just a little about him. He's an international speaker, thinker, intellectual activist for Islam and Muslim affairs. His work involves explaining and demonstrating by rational argument the intellectual proofs for the Islamic belief system and promoting the Islamic way of life and Islamic solutions for contemporary problems. On a personal note, Abdullah takes Islamic opinions from the classical Sunni schools of thought, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And also, there's a lot more to say, but I'll keep it brief for now. I will say, subhanAllah, this is one of the more important talks for everyone, inshallah. And also, if you can take notes and follow along and stick around with us, inshallah. And with that being said, I'll pass it on to our dear brother Abdullah Al Andalusi.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salam Nabi Kareem Muhammad wa alihi tayyibin wa sahbihi salihin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. To everyone, the organizers, the attendees, and I want to give my thanks to them to organizing this, and obviously, inshallah, hopefully it'll be beneficial for everybody. I'd also like to just mention that I would say I'm a brother, but not so special. So just an average Joe, as you Americans say. And inshallah, like all of you, we've been enlightened with the Deen of Islam, alhamdulillah, and that's something that we can only ever get izzah by sharing that, inshallah, and obviously trying to uphold that. So anyway, also just to caveat that because it's about 1 o'clock in the morning in the UK, I will be joined by my trusty friend, some Red Bull, so do forgive me for chugging that down, but inshallah it'll keep me sharp during this discussion. So I know that we probably have an international audience, seeing as we have advertised, obviously the organizers and I myself have advertised this event, but I'm probably safe in assuming that we have a lot of was it Floridians, perhaps? Is that how you pronounce it? Or and people from the United States of America. Now, I was made aware that in the United States of America currently, there is a little bit of a concern over rising doubts that Muslims are experiencing. Many Muslims, according to I think it was a Pew poll survey, if I'm correct, or maybe it was a survey of some kind that suggested that up to almost a quarter of Muslims born in a Muslim environment or family have reported to have left Islam. Of course, you have an equal, if not greater, proportion of Muslims coming into people coming into Islam, so reverts coming into Islam. That being said, this kind of situation is being replicated, not as severe or intense, but in a similar kind of manner in the rest of the world, in Muslim world, and so on and so forth. There's a number of reasons that this is that is causing this. I'm going to be very brief on this because I want to get straight into the actual discussion on understanding how can we know the purpose of life. So I would say that irrespective of whether a people know the truth or not, how people handle truth over centuries and centuries can really can distort it in many ways, and sometimes people can fail to understand the truth, even if they might profess to believe in it, and they're told it, right? So, for example, over time, many Muslims have learned Islam as a kind of a checklist of doctrines to believe in. They're told it based on blind faith. Generally, they're told that even doubting is wrong, or you shouldn't doubt. Is what and you shouldn't. That includes not answering questions that they might legitimately have, and this has caused, obviously, this problem to be exacerbated. Also, that many Muslims understand Islam in a very dogmatic way, with in a way that's very oversimplified from maybe centuries of kind of oversimplification, kind of crude understanding for the lay people, which got worse and worse and worse over time, such that it doesn't represent classical Islam and the classical understandings, which scholars in the past would have been shocked to see the level of understanding that Muslims have today, if they could ever come back forward in time to see this time. So there is a bit of a disconnect there, and many Muslims believe Islam is is to be this case. It's just a natural case. And many people leave Islam because they are taught Islam in such a way that, and just to illustrate this point, for example, they're taught in such a way that there's just misunderstandings of Islam itself. So I remember there was this one ex-Muslim reported that one of the things that didn't make sense to them about Islam was how it portrayed the history prior to the coming of Islam in 7th century Arabia amongst the pagan Arabs. He said, it was said that they used to bury alive all daughters. All daughters were buried alive. But then how would they reproduce, right? How would they actually have women to reproduce with? That doesn't make any sense. Whereas, no, that's not what happened. What happened was that it was the firstborn daughters of the pagan Arabs. It was a big shame if the firstborn of the family, which would be the head of the family, which was going to be the head of the family, was actually a female and not a male. And this wasn't occurring with every single Arab family, of course, but generally if you were nobility or you were a respected middle class, so to speak, there'd be a great social pressure on you to look like your family is strong. And a strong family in pagan kind of culture was that it has to be the firstborn being a male. And you can see this replicated, not in exactly the same way, obviously, but this female infanticide is quite prevalent amongst certain polytheistic cultures, like, for example, in India, as well as in China. Female infanticide, not necessarily killing children after they're born, although that can happen, but usually abortions when now, because obviously medical science has allowed people to discover what the gender is of the child before the child is born. Anyway, my point is this, that the understanding of Islam itself has become ossified, oversimplified, and doesn't resemble classical Islamic understanding. So my point is, today I'm not going to be bringing in anything new at all whatsoever. The only thing new is perhaps explaining this in 21st century English language from the UK. That's the only new, if even that. So this isn't, inshallah, but let's get on to the actual topic. So as for non-Muslims, I hope there's some non-Muslims have attended today, just out of curiosity. And if you are from a Muslim background, but you are no longer Muslim, I also invite you to kind of open your mind to kind of looking into these questions. But really, I wanted to kind of explain something. How to understand the purpose of life. It's really based on a lot of the revert experience, you could say. Many reverts to Islam who don't speak Arabic and would not understand the linguistic miracle of the Quran. I became Muslim. I didn't even know there was a linguistic miracle of the Quran. It wasn't. I was at a time when it wasn't many English books on that subject, if at all. And when I became Muslim, there was no discussion. I only discovered it later on in time, when there was books coming out about linguistic miracle of the Quran. The scientific miracles of the Quran again came a bit later after I converted to Islam. But many reverts to Islam don't become Muslim because of the alleged scientific miracles in the Quran or the linguistic miracle of the Quran. They become Muslim because, and they will report this as it makes sense. Islam makes sense to them, or they recognize it in some way. It would say it seems like this would be the explanation that explains everything that they can observe. That it's very intuitive for most these reverts. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, look, if there's a purpose of life, why does it need all this philosophy and all this research and study just to arrive at it, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? Like, why can't it just be simple? Well, here's the thing. It actually is very simple. It's extraordinarily simple. In fact, when I was first considering Islam, I initially didn't think it might have any answers because it was simple. It seemed to be deceptively simple, because I was told by the culture I was raised up in, due to the films and the books, and just some rich people's flirtation with Eastern philosophy and spirituality, and getting enlightenment after spending decades doing meditation, and those kinds of expectations made me believe with a false conception that somehow to find the truth will take years and years and years of contemplation, and will take advanced philosophies using jargon which most people don't understand, but that wouldn't make any sense. Because how comes then the average person can't access the truth then, or doesn't have the time to access the truth, or it doesn't, that wouldn't make any sense generally. But the truth is actually very simple, and if you were to say it to a child, and that's why I think many Muslim children growing up, they don't have so much the kind of cognitive dissonance that you might get in other religions, people from other religions, because it just seems very almost straightforward and obvious into the fact, like, oh, well, there's one God over everything that exists. Everything doesn't make itself. It was made by this one God who controls everything. Everything seems to fit together, so there can't be multiple gods. And of course, we were made. We have a life. We have choice. We have our thinking ability. We have to put all these things into practice to do things in glory, to glorify God, because everything was created by him, and by default is a glorification of him. It's a very simple understanding. But why people today think that's not so persuasive is not because there's some kind of incoherence in that. No, it's because those who don't want to believe it and be under account, accountable for their actions under a God who created everything. Maybe because they've embraced individualist ideologies. Maybe it's just because as an individual, they just don't want to be under anything higher than their own desires. For a number of psychological reasons, people, instead of submitting to what their intellect tells them to submit to, instead, they make their intellects, in a way, submit to them and become a tool for them to try to mentally compartmentalize, or to make a confusion to avoid the truth. They first lie to themselves. It's not like some conspiracy that they are trying to, I must lie to everybody else. No, the first lie is lying to themselves. I want to give an analogy. Not everyone probably understands it, but it's a great example, which is there's a film called Inception. Don't know if everyone has heard of that film or seen that film. It's about people hacking dreams and getting into people's subconscious by hacking minds, so to speak, and putting them to sleep, and then entering in their minds via dream states and so on. So it was that kind of thing. Now, apparently, in this kind of movie, the subconscious of any individual doesn't like being hacked by interlopers, right? So in order for interlopers to kind of spend some time in that mind without being kicked out by that mind's subconscious, they have to create a virtual world inside the mind and make it into a maze so much so that the subconscious and the figures and representations of someone's subconscious in the form of maybe other people in this dream don't notice these foreigners coming into that person's mind, and they kick them out. So they have to make it a maze so they can hide in that maze, and it will take some time for the subconscious to find these interlopers and kick them out. That was basically roughly the plot, kind of, or the mechanism of this dream called Inception. Now, what people who are who call themselves skeptics, right, today like to do is, if they don't want to believe a particular idea, they will try and to invent a maze, so to speak, to detach an observation of reality, something that makes sense, from your intellect coming to it. So they make a maze of confusion to say, well, maybe how do we know that the universe, for example, wasn't made by multiverse, didn't pop out of nothing, for example, these kind of things. And then they will try to use, they'll try to twist any area where humans don't have full understanding of, let's say, the current frontiers of science. At any point in human history, they've always used human ignorance to kind of obscure the truth. For example, they'll say, well, quantum mechanics has shown that causality doesn't necessarily follow cause and effect. And it's like, well, no, it doesn't, it hasn't refuted causality. There's no refutation of causality. All there is that you can show that there is cause and effect over great distance, maybe possibly beyond the speed of light, reaching from one cause and to the effect. So faster than the speed of light, right? You can, so that is the only thing that's demonstrated. But that cause and effect occur, again, is not refuted. They'll make up speculations like, oh, well, maybe there's something like retro causality, so a cause can cause its can cause an effect, which will in essence cause itself in some kind of loop. That's not been experimentally demonstrated, and yet again, that's just a speculation. And because you don't know about quantum mechanics, let's say, you'll fall into that mistake. You'll think, okay, well, maybe that could be the case. I don't know, right? Even though it's irrational and it doesn't make any sense. Now, people, then they would say things like, oh, science has proven that human intuition is contradicted by empirical evidence, by what you can observe. So whenever humans expected something else happened, so you can't trust the intuition. I call this anti-rationalism, so the attempt but to refute or deny rationality in the mind. And again, no, that's also false. What's happened is that all that experiments have ever shown throughout human history is that human assumption has been wrong, but not the law of non-contradiction has never been contradicted, for example, right? Causality has never been breached. And I always give a typical example of this when, for example, the ancient Greeks believed that obviously the bodies, the kind of celestial bodies orbited the Earth, so the geocentric model. And because if they're orbiting, if they're going around, the perfect shape for going around is obviously a circle. Therefore, the celestial bodies orbit the Earth via a circle, in a circle shape, in a circular motion. The problem is that when they observed where these bodies were meant to be, they weren't there. They were in positions that didn't make any sense. And so they had to bend their calculations to fit it, but it never made sense to them. Now, if you were, let's say, a skeptic or an atheist back then, if there was a skeptic or atheist back then who was trying to undermine rationality, they'd say, oh, look, you see, this proves that rationality doesn't make, cannot be proved. In fact, rationality is contradicted by observation. It's like, what? No. Rationality hasn't been contradicted by observation. Neither is there contradiction in the universe. But the assumption by the ancient Greeks that these celestial bodies would have orbited the Earth. That's assumption one. Assumption two, that the orbit must be circular. These are just assumptions. Rationality doesn't mandate any of these assumptions. Rationality doesn't necessitate any of those two assumptions. It's just assumptions. And all that science has ever shown is that human assumptions about how the universe works have been wrong multiple times. Likewise, so we call the universe the ayat of Allah, right? You could say that the signs of Allah, right? The signs of the Creator. Also, the ayat also can mean a verse, right? It can be referring to a verse of Quran. The other ayat of Allah, which is the Quran, is much the same way. I would say that if something doesn't make sense, and I've always found this, if something appears not to make sense, I always discover that it's nothing to do with any mistake or error in the Quran or in Islamic beliefs based on clear text and definite texts, but rather it's the assumptions we made or the assumptions you were taught about those texts that were wrong. And inshallah, I'm going to be answering a number of questions to show you where these hidden assumptions were. I once saw this documentary. It was called The Medieval Mind, and it was about Christian Europe during the Dark Ages, quote unquote. And it was talking about all the kind of superstitions that ancient these Christians believed in. They managed to actually convince themselves, some of them, that there was a race of people who had the heads of dogs, but the bodies of human beings. And then there was discussion about, do they have souls? Can we convert them to Christianity? Where do they exist? Is it the east or the west? It was quite hilarious. But one of the historians mentioned in that documentary that the medieval mind wasn't any less rational than we are today. It was their starting assumptions that perverted their thought. And that is exactly the same case today. I would say that the Islam that you probably were raised with and taught in schools and taught by teachers, which were just maybe teaching very simple and unsophisticated doctrines, which to people who are never expected to think about this stuff, because that's currently, unfortunately, the situation in the Muslim world, and it's very alien to what happened in Islamic history. By the way, our ancestors were much more sophisticated, which would explain our current condition. But I don't want to digress. So let's go on to discussing how can we know the purpose of life through first principles. I will be mentioning verses of the Quran, but only to compare, right? Just by comparison. We're going to start with the assumption that we don't know that Islam is true or correct. I want to also make a caveat that the only reason why this subject would be difficult to it wouldn't be like done in just a simple half an hour or 1 hour, or I mean, I'm doing a 10-week course in essence called the Dawah Masterclass, but in essence it's just the elaboration of this one subject. It's because skeptics, atheists, people from the world of religions and critics of Islam have made it that complicated because they've tried to insert many assumptions in and attack Islam, strawman Islam. And in order to kind of deal with those assumptions, you need historical research, textual research. Obviously, many scholars, alhamdulillah, I've worked with many scholars to look into these matters through about 20 years of my life since being a Muslim, as well as physicists, chemists, biologists, every conceivable subject, only because the critics of Islam, in order to trying to avoid obviously accepting the truth for reasons best known to them, which we can discuss later on, are trying to invent reasons to attack Islam and trying to obviously strawman Islam. And many Muslims themselves are defending a version of Islam which is not really traditional, classical Islam, but it's a kind of post-colonial dogmatic version, which unfortunately is why we're having this rampant down. So anyway, let's get into it. There are basically going to be 4 stages to this investigation. So we're going to do it by stages, right? So different stages of our investigation, and we start from a perspective of not knowing anything at all. So let's go on into that very quickly. Am I understandable? I was warned by the organizers that my British accent might bedevil you in trying to understand me. I hope I am clear and legible. Is that, can anyone understand me okay? Is this a good talking speed, or am I speaking too fast?
It seems everyone's saying yes, that they can understand you very fine, and your speed's fine. Jazakallah khair.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Okay, barakallahu feek. Okay, so let's go for this first stage. So basically, I'm not going to get too much into the historical detail of where skepticism came from. It's obviously an ancient Greek school of thought. I've discussed that in a course I did on the history of Western philosophy at the Quran Institute, which is the same place I'm going to be doing this Dawah Masterclass on the 30th of October. But skepticism, the idea was, I suppose, the intention behind it was to try to shave off all these assumptions that have accrued into the human mind from whichever tradition, background, and culture, in order to gain certain knowledge. Right? That was, I suppose, its claimed goals. However, in the modern form of skepticism, and one certainly embraced by those who deny theism, who deny God and religion, it's almost deemed as a way of life, not as a tool. And in that sense, it's deemed as that they will just deny everything, or they will say they deny knowledge of everything, unless they have clear and perfect knowledge of all things. Then they, and they have a level of certainty that requires them to be a creator, them to be a divine God that has infinite knowledge. Unless you're that, you can't have certain knowledge, and that's the argument they, in a way, they are in effect making. Right? When you ask them what's the level of criteria for accepting something as certain, they will say, they will disagree as to even that they exist themselves. I don't even know if I exist. Well, I'm going to say this quite bluntly. We know for certain, we each know for certain that we exist, because consciousness, right? Or rather, you're experiencing something. So what's doing the experiencing, right? The very fact that you actually are experiencing something means that you exist, and you can know that for certain. Okay, it doesn't matter if you're living in a matrix or brain in a vat, being controlled by aliens who are putting signals into your brain to make you think you're in a reality, or whatever kind of scenario, or Descartes' daemon, like an evil deity that controls the universe. How do you know that they're not controlling your reality, and so on and so forth? Regardless of that, what you know for certain is that you exist, right? Because you're experiencing something. So that's the first thing. Then from that you build onto the next level, the next pillar, which is, well, you're experiencing something, and you can't control what you're experiencing. Something's coming into your senses, regardless of what if you are a brain in a vat or a computer program or whatever. If you want to believe some eccentric billionaires who think that, living in a simulation, regardless of that, you're experiencing something outside yourself, right? There exists an outside yourself, right? I don't know if that's clear to everyone. You know that there is something outside yourself. You're not the only thing that exists, full stop. And if you were even the only thing that exists, if you were someone who was born with a coma, but you could think, if that's even possible, but let's just say you all you could see was darkness, you couldn't see anything, and you just know that you exist. The very fact that you didn't bring yourself into existence, and yet you exist, would be again evidence that, or at least rationally, you'd know, well, I don't remember any eternity before this point. There can't be an eternity before this point, because you can't exhaust eternity. You can't finish counting eternity. So you could deduce that even if you couldn't see anything, that you yourself were started by something else. You were created by something else, even if you couldn't see anything at all whatsoever. Right? These are just basic rational points of observation. Now, you do see an outside world, right? So what is this outside world that you're observing? Now, again, people say, well, look, Abdullah, how do you know that you're not living in the matrix? How do you know you're not living a brain in the vat? And I say, it's actually, in a way, it's actually irrelevant, because what you're seeing is always going to be real. And what I mean by that is there's always going to be a reality that you're observing. Let's say the matrix, right? So a computer simulation. A computer simulation, these programs that you're observing, and sprites and things, let's just say, they exist somewhere. They exist in a hard drive. They exist by a processor, and switches, ones and zeros, conjuring them in front of you. But they come from somewhere. There is an origin for all things. Right? They don't just pop out of nothing. So there's, even in the matrix, there is the programs you're observing, they have a reality to them. They have an origin to them. Likewise, even if you were in the middle of a fever and you're delirious, okay, and you start hallucinating and seeing things that aren't there, these hallucinations have reality. Right? They have not to scare anyone who's been having that recently, I know. But what I mean by that is they're coming from your subconscious, or from neurons misfiring due to increased temperature in the brain, presumably, if that's the cause of your hallucinating, it's a fever, and they are producing the simulation of images onto your matched with the stimuli coming in from your visual cortex, from your eyes. So in essence, it's blending in two different stimuli, one from two different you could say sources. One is from the outside world, and one is from your obviously neurons. But it comes from somewhere. It's being caused by something. That's the point. So all things have a reality. Where there is a confusion, what we mean by the only difference, I would say, between these different things is the category they fit into. So if you were in a computer program, what you'd be observing, it wouldn't be not real. It would just be something that's not physical outside of the hard drive, right? It would be fit into the category of a virtual program. It wouldn't be something in which is composed of atoms, but composed of how the program would work, pixels, which come from electrical signals and so on, so forth. So which are obviously come from a magnetic based or solid state hard drive, right? But that's the only difference is how do you categorize? I'll give you another example. You could say unicorns are real, right? You can quote, I suppose you're going to be quoting me. I've just been in this lecture of Abdullah Al Andalusi, and he's been saying unicorns are real, right? Real, not real in the sense of they exist in the material world, but real as in that they exist as a concept in the human mind, which also, which people have given expression of in drawings, right? That's the reality of it, of unicorns. They don't exist in the material world, but they exist in the human mind as in the form of a concept, right? Or they're no more than a concept. However, you could say that they could also exist as images, right? One of the interesting things is that in the Quran, it describes these false idols and false gods, being burnt in Jahannam, being burnt in hell, and also that describing that these false idols. That's because these idols only exist as stone statues and as concepts, or if fantastical imagining concepts in the minds of people, but they don't exist as creators in the universe. They don't exist as deities at all. So this is how we understand that this is the concept. The concept has a reality, as in the concept exists, but the concept doesn't. But the notion that we're having is not something that relates to something that exists in the material world. So the bottom line is everything has a reality. The question is how you categorize these things, and so on. So even fantasy made up stuff has a reality. It's just that it's not a reality in what we would call the real world, right? Or the material world outside us, or the world beyond. Anyway, so that's that. So we know there's an external world to us. For certain, we know there's an external world to us. You can't control it. And you'll see. I'll explain it later on. Something connected to the fact that you can't more proof that you can't control it. Right. So then, what do we observe from this external world? Right. Well, regardless of whether what you're observing exists in the physical world or in the computer program, they all share the same qualities, which is what you're seeing is change. You're seeing change. Things aren't static. Things are changing. Things are existing distinct from each other. Right? You're getting sensation of different things. You're not getting only one sensation of only all you can see is just one color. For example, you can see multiple objects or multiple things, regardless of which environment is causing these things to appear to you. These things are distinct from each other. So there's a multiplicity of things. They're changing. You're seeing change occur. So certainly you're undergoing change, or what we call time. And then we can begin asking questions based on these premises that can't be denied, right? Can't be challenged. So if anyone currently we've now refuted nihilism or ontological nihilism. Now we've now refuted that. We've refuted epistemological nihilism, right? So now we've moved. This is stage one. We've moved the bar forward a bit. Now we're going to get to well, what is the ultimate reality behind what we are observing? So we're observing change. Okay, so we're going to ask the question now, what initiates change, or where did, was there an eternity past of change, for example? An eternity past of change, of changing things, all these things, have they always existed? What you're observing, have they always existed? And have they existed for eternity like this? Have you existed for eternity? Well, no, you know that you can't exist for eternity. At least you don't remember existing for eternity. So you know that your memory hasn't existed for eternity. That's the first thing you can deduce. The second thing you can deduce is that an eternity past, and what you mean by that is an infinite past for these finite things that are changed, whatever they are, whatever their reality is. This infinite past, if there was an infinite past prior to this point in time, we would never reach this point in time. What I mean is, imagine you came to this this lecture today and you saw that the organizer said Abdullah hasn't arrived yet. He's not online yet. But wait, he said he'll be there in an infinite amount of time. So just you know, have a sit down, have some tea, and he'll be on. You'll see, well, he won't be on, because if we have to wait an infinite amount of time, and the definition of infinite is basically it can't be counted, it can't be exhausted, then we would never reach the end of infinite amount of time. Likewise, if I said that this lecture will go on for an infinite amount of time, and then you can ask Q&A, would any of you ever get to the Q&A session? Well, no, because you wouldn't have exhausted an infinite amount of time to get to that point. So what you can deduce is that for all this change that you're observing, there was a beginning to it. That's the inescapable truth of that, and you can deduce that for definite. The second thing is substance. What are the things that you're observing made out of? Okay. Now, let's assume that the universe you're seeing is real, in the sense of it exists as a material universe outside yourself, of which you are a part of. So in essence, your senses aren't lying to you. If you accept that, just to give an example. So okay, so we see objects. You know, what is this object made out of? Well, it's made out of plastic and water. What's the water and the plastic made out of? Well, they're made out of molecules. What the molecules made out of? They're made out of atoms. Okay, great. What they're made out of? Subatomic particles. What they're made out of, and going all the way down to quarks, and then maybe possibly types of quantum fluctuation or what have you. Okay, that's fine. And then what are they made out of? So what is comprising them? You start to split it down. The thing is, if there was an infinite amount, or not infinite, but infinite amount of levels below this level of reality. So if you're saying that basically you could split particles down to an infinite amount of smaller and smaller particles or energy packets or what have you, would anything actually have any substance at all? Because if you're saying that you could infinitely split down any piece of substance, what you're in essence saying is that there is no substance, because there's never a point where the buck stops, where the point stops and say, right, now we've got this, we've reached this foundation, this foundation upon which matter is based upon is, and what is defined by. No, in essence, you're saying that matter or substance has no ultimate substance. And it's for the same reason as why we know there's no infinite past. It's called an infinite regress fallacy, which is basically you can't have you can't exhaust an infinite amount of things. So we know there's a start point for the same reason that we know that there's a substance, ultimately a fundamental substance, or something fundamental behind all things, which is which gives it reality, which gives it substance, in essence. Now, the question is, of course, what is making this substance? What is this fundamental substance? Like, what is it then? Because if this fundamental substance isn't made of anything, right? What is giving it its properties? Why is it doing what it's doing, in essence, right? If there's nothing inside it that's making it do what it does, then what is giving it these properties? The only, again, I'll leave it just there for a second, but we know there's a fundamental, there must be some kind of ultimate fundamental thing behind all material things, which is maintaining what we observe as substance, whatever it might be, whatever we are observing, but it's maintaining substance. The third thing, the third observation is that what we are observing is finite things. Now, I know I use the word finite. It's not philosophical jargon, of course, but it just basically means that something is bounded, right? So this bottle is bounded by limitations. It doesn't exist outside those limitations, or its effect on the rest of the external world is bounded by, or doesn't exceed its shape or substance, with the possible exception of maybe radiation and gravitational effects. But apart from that, but again, proportionate to its mass, right? So anyway, it has a certain proportion to itself. It's limited to a certain extent. So I'm just going to pause that there. Someone asked the question, what wouldn't that be saying substance is infinite? Not that it doesn't exist, because technically if you divide everything more down and more down, it keeps going, it's never going to run out. Okay, so a sister asked, are you saying that substance is infinite? Wouldn't that be saying that substance is infinite? No, I'm saying that substance, I suppose the word means, in a way, substance is meaning something, right? There is something there. So if you're saying that you can cut it down infinitely, but never reach anything underneath it, right? There's nothing that is made out of that you could find. For an infinite amount of cuttings, what that's saying is that there's actually nothing there, all right? Because you're basically saying that it can be cut, and there's never anything, you'll never reach a point where you're saying, okay, this is what it's based on. Just to give you an example, it's like saying, you see, I've always given this example, you see a pond, right? And you see a pond and it has water up to a certain level. Okay, maybe it's a very deep pond, you can't see the bottom of the pond. So someone tells you, oh, this pond is called the bottomless pond. They say, why is that? Well, because it doesn't have a bottom, right? It just goes all the way down infinitely. Why wouldn't that make sense for you, right? Why wouldn't that make sense? Reason being is because, well, then you'd say, well, what's keeping it up? And why at that certain level, right? Why it's being kept up at that certain level? What's holding up all this water? If you're saying that it has an infinite bottom, that means there's ultimately nothing holding up the water. Or it's like saying that, there's a branch. You just see a branch and a tree goes all the way down and into the earth, and someone tells you it's an infinitely long tree. You just don't see the roots, but it goes all the way down to the bottom, to its roots. And you say, well, if it's an infinitely long tree, it wouldn't have roots, because at what point in the tree is there going to be the roots? If it's infinite, right? At what point going down that tree would you ever reach the roots? And the roots are required to support the whole tree. So if you cut matter or substance down infinitely, and you're saying that it can be cut infinitely, then you're basically saying that matter doesn't actually exist, or substance doesn't exist. Oh, okay. The sister has said that makes sense. You misunderstood what I'm saying. Okay, I'm glad I explained it better. Thank you for the question. So it allows us to kind of elaborate on this matter. Someone says, so limit as x approaches infinity of this function equals 0. I want to try to keep mathematics out of it, just because I want to keep it simple for the average layperson to understand. There is a confusion in mathematics regarding Cantor sets and infinity. Without going into detail, there is no infinity in mathematics. There's only, you could say that it's only mathematics is just generally a counting rule, right? So it's only as infinite as you can be infinite, which to count, right? Or you have a processor as infinite to count, which you don't. Basically the decimal system is count till 9 and then put a 0 and add a 1 and continue. Basically, that is decimal system, and everything based upon that. There's no such thing as the number line that exists as an actual infinite existence. Someone says, can an infinite amount of space, can a finite amount of space, like say 12 inches, be infinitely divided in half, like 12 inches to 6 inches? And the thing is this: you could say, can it be infinitely divided? In mathematics, there would never be a point where you could, where the mathematical system of counting, or in this case dividing, will not be able to continue dividing, but only as an abstract concept. In essence, if you could infinitely exist for an infinite amount of time doing that, you could then divide going on forever. But divide on a in an abstract way, you're not actually dividing anything. It's a conceptual division, but you're not really dividing anything anyway. That's the point. It's a counting rule, it's a dividing rule, it's a multiplying rule, it's a subtracting rule. That's what the operations of mathematics are. Could you give a bit and do the question? All right, Khair, inshallah. I want to continue our discussion. So that's substance, and then as for finitude, the question is, in any object that you observe, which is finite, is limited. The question is, what is giving it its limits? So you would say, maybe with this object, its limitation. Did it make itself, or was it made by something else? Of course, in this case, it was made by something else. However, if what gives it its limits will also be the substance, right? It's made of something and builds up to this level, to this shape and so on. But if I was to find the most fundamental thing, which is just a finite thing, let's say, and it is limited. Someone asked me a question: how do you know that there's not an eternal limited thing, right? So an eternally existing limited thing. Why is that? Why can that not be the case? Well, the question is, if this finite thing, which is going to be fundamental, so it can't be divided further, and it's limited, where does its limits come from? So if it wasn't made by anything else, that means that it wasn't defined by anything else. In English, defined means, from the Latin definis, means to give it its limitations, right? So if it wasn't given its limitations by something outside itself, that means it's giving its limitations. It's the one that's giving itself these limitations, right? And if it's giving itself its limitations, and it's not made of any energy, it's not made of anything, it's the most fundamental particle, let's just say, or thing. If it can define itself, in essence, then it's not limited at all, because it can choose whatever it wants to be or do. And when we talk about limitation, what does limitation mean? Limitation means the effect of something, right? So if something's power to affect things, either it comes from something else, i.e. it was made by something else, or it comes from itself. And if it comes from itself, if it can choose exactly what effect it wants to produce, if it determines its own effect and is not made of energy, it doesn't have a storehouse of energy, it will deplete if it pushes too far out, or whatever example, right? Then it is really not a finite thing at all. It's something that is infinite, because it can decide what effect it wants to do, to what extent it wants to make that effect. If it determines its own effect, if its effect is determined by something else, that is what we call creation, right? When you make something, and this bottle has an effect, right? It has a certain weight, it displaces a certain amount of air, it obviously causes gravitation due to its mass. It has a certain effect, right? It didn't determine this effect. It was determined by something else to it. But ultimately, there must be something which determined the finite things of everything else, or the finitude, or the effects of all things in creation. We can go more into that, but I don't want to kind of spend too much time on that one thing. And lastly and finally, the fourth thing that we observed from whatever we are observing is specificity, which is that this bottle is not is not twice the size it is or half the size it is. It is this specific size with this specific color and shape and form. So the question is, what gave it its limits? Yes, and now what made those limits in that very specific way and not in a different way, right? What determined it, in essence? Now, if you say, well, it was determined by something else, and determined by something else, and determined by something else, and you ask, well, what determined that? What determined that? You can't have an infinite chain of things determining, going back in the past, let's say, because again, you would never get to this object existing. You never get to you existing. So at some point there is something that determines, but itself isn't determined by something else. And that's the only way to avoid contradiction. Someone said, I know the universe is... Okay, I'm going to answer a lot more of these questions in the Q&A session, because I want to kind of just get to the end. So, but all these questions, inshallah, we're going to try to go through, however long it takes, or however much time I'm permitted by the organizers. But I do want to cover as many questions as possible. So, so basically, we get to this point where you have the beginning, the first, something that initiates motion, but itself isn't moved. So, or something that initiates change, but itself is not changed. You've got something that is defining substance, but itself isn't made of a substance. Right? Itself is not made of a substance. It's not divided further. You have to reach a point, and it must be sustaining all other substances, because all other substances, if you break them down, they must reach some fundamental substance. And the fundamental substance, where is it getting its attributes from? Because it's making it is the building blocks of finite things. Itself is finite. So if it is finite, then where is its attributes coming from? Where is its characteristics coming from if it's finite? And its characteristics are originating from where? What is making the smallest particle possible? Maybe we haven't seen it yet, but what is making that smallest particle do what it does, or that superstring vibrate at the frequency it does? What does it even mean to do that? Well, where's that energy coming from? Right? Where is it coming from? If it's the most fundamental thing there is, there's nothing smaller than itself that makes it, it doesn't have any internal mechanisms, then what is making it act in a finite way, not in an infinite way? Right? So why is it only limited in its acting? Then we have to say that the only possible explanation is that what's giving it that motional ability to act when it has no internal mechanism to act is something else that is not finite, like this fundamental particle. So there's something sustaining all substance in the universe. The cause of all finitude, the thing behind everything that's finite must be infinite. It was not determined or limited or created by anything else, because to create is to shape something into its finite form. And so if this thing doesn't have any limitations and it starts to change, it created everything else, then this thing itself is uncreated, because it doesn't have any limitations that require creating. Someone asked me that question, I believe, on the Q&A. And lastly, specificity, which is where did the choice come from to make things in a certain way? How comes this universe doesn't have one quark more than it does, or one quark less than it does? And if you were to say, well, Abdullah, how do you know how much maybe the universe is infinite in mass and in energy? Let's just say because you haven't observed it. Well, I'll say, how comes within the observable universe there is only a certain amount of matter, and not a greater amount or a greater concentration per unit volume in the observable universe? So that's still a question we can legitimately ask. Now, the argument would be from some atheists would be that, well, what determined something is randomness or chance. But randomness doesn't really exist. We know that everything basically, like, where did what caused something to appear in one way and not appear in another way? Right? Now you say randomness, but what does randomness mean? Because we have no conception of randomness. You roll a dice, and you might think it's random, but it's not, because you could calculate the weight of the dice, the air particles or molecules rather, at the time, the exact strength of gravity at that particular point on the Earth's surface, and a whole number of calculations, you could determine with a precision, generally speaking, what the result of that dice roll was, what determined that dice roll to be the way it was. But true randomness, we've actually never observed. And also, how could it possibly exist? Because what is causing something to be decided one way and not the other way? So ultimately speaking, there has to be, to avoid any paradoxes in any of these four things, motion, substance, finitude, and specificity, there has to be an origin of motion, an origin of behind all substance, as in a maintainer behind all substance, something that defines things but is in itself not defined, and something that determines the limits of things to their proportion or proportions them, but itself doesn't have a proportion. And really, if you're thinking about something that can initiate change or motion from a state of no change, let's say, and no motion, then what they're doing is they're basically increasing, and I call it increasing from nothing, as in they are producing an increase from absolute nothing, which means that they can create energy from nothing. Because to initiate motion from a state of no motion, when there's no, in the world today, that only happens when you have a force that occurs. So this thing can actually initiate motion from complete standstill, so to speak, which would mean that it has the ability to create from nothing or increase from nothing, and therefore is inexhaustible in power. Power just means the ability to get work done, right? Work done over time, as physicists would say. So this thing has the ability to has infinite power by definition, but itself is not finite or limited, or looks like any creature or created thing. You could deduce this rationally. Now, I've really summarized all these things because of the limits of time, but I mean, there's a reason why I'm doing a 10-week course on this. With diagrams, we'll be going through these philosophical concepts and looking at all the possible contentions that could possibly be argued. Now, the next, and this is kind of going to reach in the first stage, the next stage would be, how do you know, okay, maybe there's an infinite thing that creates, but why is it a God? Why would you say it's a God? Where'd you get that idea from? Now you're just kind of, aren't you begging the question now? That, oh, must be God because it is infinite. Well, no. The reason being is because why did it initiate motion, initiate substance, so to start defining substance, start defining and defining it to a specific proportion? Why did it pick that? Why did it pick doing that? So there are now two possibilities, right? One is this so the atheists, who try to be imaginative, will argue there's a multiverse, right? There's a multiverse that does this. In essence, there's an infinite existence of an infinite universe, or that creates many bubble universes according to one model. Or there's some infinite existence. Let's just say the common denominator is there's an infinite existence which makes multiple finite things, like our universe, our observable universe, and maybe there's many others, right? So it makes it randomly, just does it randomly. To which I ask, well, what is making this multiverse make universes, right? What is causing it to make universes? So they'll say, now either that there's two things. One, there's something, so you have this multiverse, and there's something outside this multiverse that's making it, pushing it to make universes, or there's an internal mechanism inside the multiverse that's making it make universes, right? So let's look at the first possibility. If there's something else that's making this multiverse make universes, then the multiverse isn't the origin of creation, it's this other thing. And then now what is that thing? What's making that thing do what it's doing, or something else? And then you just get, again, an infinite regress chain where it wouldn't explain anything and would cause contradiction, a paradox. You'd have to wait an infinite amount of time for all these things to initiate this multiverse to make universes. So there would be no universes being made ever. maybe there's an internal mechanism in this universe that makes it mechanically like a factory just produce universes. Okay, but what is making this mechanism then initiate universes, making the multiverse make universes? Or maybe there's a smaller mechanism. Okay, and what's making that mechanism do make universes? Oh, an even smaller mechanism. And again, if you want to go smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as to an infinite, causing another infinite chain of causality, again, nothing would be caused, because it's like saying that you have a watch, and in this watch, what's making the hands move is there's a smaller mechanism inside that watch that's making the hands move. Okay, what's making that mechanism move? Oh, there's a smaller mechanism inside that, and a smaller mechanism inside that, a smaller mechanism going on for infinity. If that's the case, in order for the hand to move, you have to wait an infinite amount of mechanisms to finish making each other, to get to the point of basically making that hand move. The hand would never move. So the multiverse theory collapses because it can't get away from paradoxes, from contradictions, right? And that's the problem. But what is left then? What remains? Well, what remains is that the creator or the originator behind the universe, whatever it is, it initiated creating the universe itself with no internal mechanism, no external pressure making it do that. And what do we call that? If it can initiate it without prior cause, well, we call this choice. And if something has choice, that's the definition of a will. So if something has inexhaustible power, it has power, it's inexhaustible, it can make from nothing, and it has choice, the ability to choose and initiate voluntarily, that's the minimal definition of what we would call God, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Arabic language. And that's how we know there's choice. Now, the second stage, now remember, all this we deduced without knowing that what we are seeing is 100% accurate, right? And I wrote a tweet on my Twitter where I said that the only thing we can truly be certain of is that we exist, and there's an external reality, and ultimately there is a creator behind this external reality and ourselves. That's the only thing we can prove for absolute certain. The philosophical definition of certainty. So empiricists won't like this, empiricists, but that means that basically the God's existence is more certain than your senses. All right. So when people say, I only believe what I see, and I doubt God's existence, that's what an empiricist might say, a strict empiricist. But you say, actually, it's all the way around. You don't know for certain that what you're seeing is entirely accurate or a correct representation of the external world. Whereas the existence of God is the only possible conclusion that avoids any kind of contradictions, and is therefore the only thing we can be certain of. And that actually is the kind of how we should be debating with atheists, or if you are an atheist watching this, I mean, this is, I would obviously invite you during the Q&A to please come and challenge, or if you are unconvinced or you need further clarification, because this is a horrible summary of what I would probably take a few more hours going through more in depth and detail. But I want to get now to, okay, so God made a choice. But as atheists like to argue, which God? Right? Which God made this choice? Right? Who? Is it Thor? Is it Zeus? Who? Which God made this choice? Well, first and foremost, this is actually incorrect. In any culture, in any religion, going back from ancient times to Mesopotamia and so on, the empires of Mesopotamia, there has been commonalities where there are many civilizations, peoples, and religions, including in America, the Native Americans or Native Indians or whatever nomenclature they would choose to define themselves as. They believe, for example, in a world spirit, which created the world and in all intents and purposes is an infinite power and is one power, of course, and has will and has choice. So it doesn't matter what name you call this creator, as long as you believe that this creator is infinite and has a will, you basically believe in the same God that Islam does. And of course, the Quran, when it engages the reader, it expects you, if you noticed how it's worded, it expects you to have reasoned these things, to have been able to recognize these things and how they make sense. The next kind of stage, the second stage of our discussion is now engaging deists and polytheists, right? So the deists would say, well, God exists, okay, has a will, okay, but doesn't care about us. Like, why would God care about us? We are such an unbelievably small speck in an unfathomably big universe, with kind of size comparisons with involving zeros going down to the multiple powers in mathematics, right? It's really unfathomable how small, infinitesimally small we are. Not literally infinitesimally, but certainly small we are compared to the observable universe. As much as the nucleus of an atom is small compared to the electrons that orbit it, in terms of the distance between those things are actually very vast. Very unfathomably vast, almost replicates our size in the observable universe in terms of the vastness and proportionality. So it's very massive scales of small and large in this universe. Why would this God care about us, right? We're so small. To which is argued, well, first and foremost, the deists have made a mistake and an assumption, right? And this is where assumptions come into it. They've made the assumption that God is a limited creature. They've anthropomorphized God. You see, a president or a king of a country doesn't have time to listen to every single person, to know what their lives, what they're doing, to manage them, because there's so many people. And obviously the leader is going to have only a small finite attention span, right? They can't actually see or look over everyone's lives and so on and so forth. But this infinite creator, which can literally create by its own will an entire universe, you'd have to ask the question, which is, if it can create an entire universe as vast as it is, intentionally, then intending it in certain level and certain specificity, certain shape, form, and its size, that means everything that exists, including every moment in time, every moment of change, is right now intended by this same creator. I mean, if the universe couldn't make itself, how do you think it could ever sustain itself or be self-sustaining when its very substance or itself, it needs to be maintained? Ultimately, its most fundamental substance must be maintained by the power of this creator. And you're saying that the creator doesn't know about us when the creator intended us to exist and is maintaining us right now. I'm not going to get into Islamic theological debates or discussions, but many classical scholars have pointed out that they say, well, if it's infinite creator, he has infinite knowledge, and he has infinite knowledge, then surely would know about us very intimately, right? Because the knowledge and the attention span of this creator is not finite. But if you want to get more sophisticated into it, you could, depending on which school of thought within Islamic theology you want to subscribe to, others would say that God's will and knowledge are all one and the same thing. So when God willed everything to exist and is now willing to maintain it, that's coterminous with his knowledge. And so whatever he wills to maintain is exactly the extent of his knowledge. And so he knows everything that he's made, and he knows everything that he's maintaining. So he is intimately aware that we exist, and he's intimately aware you specifically exist, and everything that happens in your life, he is intimately intended to happen and knows about. So now that's where we now moved on and breached the deists. Now we've breached past the deists. Now we're going into we're next up against the polytheists, which would say, how do you know there's not more than one God? How do you know that there's only one God? Well, this is for very, very simply, in that if there was more than one infinite power with will, then they would limit each other, right? They would cause limitations upon each other, and they would not be infinite anymore or unlimited. They would just be their effects would be limited would be limited. The Quran uses another interesting argument, which is that if there were more than one power, then the universe would be in a type of chaos whereby the laws of physics would be constantly changing and would produce paradoxes as each creator changes and tries to wrestle with the other to control the universe, basically, if there were multiple powers. Now, this might seem obvious and self-evident, but this is a powerful refutation to polytheists who believe that there are multiple gods, each given a certain speciality. One controls lightning, one controls rain, one controls the fertility, one controls the sun, one controls the moon, but yet they operate under regularities, right? There's regularities in the universe. There's no such thing as, night overtaking the day and so on and so forth, meaning that you don't have these paradoxes that could happen when you have multiple deities with infinite power vying with each other and wrestling with each other. And of course, if something has infinite, so something has infinite will, but is not a finite thing, it doesn't have a physical body that limits its existence. So you can have multiple bodies living together and and they can coexist. You'd have an infinite will, which basically has a will over everything. So if something has infinite will and doesn't have a body that bounds itself to one location, let's just say, then how can you have multiple infinite wills? Because how could they coexist at the same time over the same thing if they are both over each other even? So one will would be able to control the other will, right? Because it would have any limits to its extent or what it could do. So in essence, then the second will would be subordinate to the first will and would not even be a separate will. It would just be in essence a puppet of the first. And what it ultimately means is that you can't get any way you try to conceive of multiple infinite powers produces a paradox or a contradiction, right? And of course, a more simple argument is, if there was more than one God, why? Let's say there was three gods. Why three? Why that number three? Where did the three come from? Why not 4 or 5? Because you have that now enumerated amount. The question is, what determined that amount to be in that number and not less or more? Now, if you go back in human history and you look at different religions, from the ancient Greeks, Aztecs, Mayans are not so ancient, but you look at ancient Chinese religion, you look at ancient Egyptian religion, there's something they share a commonality amongst themselves. There was always a first god, which then created the other gods. If you look at also Hinduism as well, would bear testimony to that. Brahman, the first, the ineffable spirit or power that makes the other gods and creates other gods. I remember once I heard of Hindus celebrating Krishna's birthday, and they call Krishna a god. I was like, how can a god have a birthday? That's very baffling to me. So in this regard, the refutation of polytheism is very clear in Islamic verses, and it would make sense that what we see is that in all these civilizations, we see there's always a first god that creates the other gods. There was never such thing as all these gods existing from eternity, right? They always seem to come in later, be created later in all these different religions, actually, which obviously answers the question, what came first? Polytheism, monotheism. Someone tried to ask a question along the lines of, prior to this lecture, saying that how do you know, why isn't Islam just a evidence of an evolution of human ability to create increasing abstraction over time? And I say, well, because the historical record bears the opposite. monotheism seems to be generally first, at least amongst the formalized religions, and then polytheism, it seems to degrade into polytheism, right? And if you want a great example of this, I would say, with no offense to Catholics here, but Catholicism starts from a religion whereby they believe in one God, which has no statue representing that God. And then they start now praying to saints represented in statues, and each saint has a authority or delegated authority over a particular area. The patron saint of the travelers, the patron saint of healing, the patron saint of wealth, and so on and so on and so forth. And if you're in Mexico, the patron saint of gangsters. Sounds familiar, right? Sounds similar to what we hear from many polytheisms that we've heard, because ultimately polytheism is the corruption and degradation of an original monotheism. Okay, so we've got through polytheists, deists and polytheists. Now the question, people say, why did God create us? Why did God create the universe? What was the point? What was to be gained from it? The problem with this thinking is, again, you're making the assumption, right? And remember, never make an assumption. I had a teacher at my university, and they wrote on. They said never assume, because this is how he wrote on the blackboard. He wrote, assume. He took the first three letters of that, separated it out, and then took the letter U, and then separated it out and took the two letters M-E, me. He says it makes the first three letters out of you and me, right? We always used to say that to us. Never assume, because it makes a fool out of you. Let's just put it like that, right? So I would say never make the assumption. The devil is in the assumption, and sometimes literally, right? So we assume that the Creator makes things because due to motivations that we have. We are creatures that have to survive, reproduce, and of course, that we want to, we feel a need to connect to something higher than ourselves. These are basic human instincts. We assume that the Creator must have the same motivations. For us, if someone wants to aggrandize themselves, we say that they have a fragile ego, right? So, oh, you want to aggrandize yourself? You have a fragile ego because something in your survival instinct means that you want to get people's praise so that you can feel that somehow you're protected by people liking you and they will do what you say. And so you will feel more comfortable in the world. You'll feel more secure in the world because inherently you're insecure, right? If a human being demands praise, okay, we make that assumption based on the motivations of what a human being would have. But the Creator of the universe doesn't have instincts, of creatures, wouldn't have instincts that would control him or make. I'm going to use the word him. It's not male or female, but it's not a male or female creature. But it's better than saying it, because it could be referring to an animate, an inanimate, an unwilled, mindless thing. Whereas a he just means it has personality. So a personality meaning a will or choice, right? So it can choose, it has a will. So let's call it by a word using a pronoun of personality. So let's just use the word he as a neutral term. Anyway, so why would the Creator make everything that exists? Right? Why would the Creator do so? Right? What does the Creator gain out of it? Does the Creator gain sustenance from it? Does the Creator gain anything from it? Now, let's look at an explanation that we see in the Quran for this. So in the Quran, there's a verse that says that basically Allah doesn't need anything from His creation, and that if He wanted to be satisfied, I'm going to paraphrase the verse. If He wanted to be satisfied, He could find that with Himself, right? As in, like He doesn't lack something. There's nothing that He's lacking. He doesn't feel that He's empty or bored or missing something, such that it could be satiated with creating the universe. And that would make sense, because an infinite thing wouldn't need anything else, and certainly wouldn't get bored, or because boredom is just is a psychological state of human beings, because we have a life force that demands change. So if we don't see change, we get bored, and so on. So anyway, that's I'm not going to go too much into human psychology. So what possible explanation? So what is it? What is the explanation that the Quran brings for this? What does the Quran? How does the Quran kind of produce a discussion? So if we go to see Quran Surah 16, ayah 15 to 17. So that's Quran Surah 16, 15, ayah 15 to 17. You'll see a discussion where the wording of this by the author says, and he has cast into the earth firmly set mountains, lest they should shake with you, and rivers and roads that you may be guided, and landmarks, and by the stars they are also that people are also guided. Then is he who creates like one who does not create. So will you not be reminded? Is the one who creates like the one who doesn't create? In essence, if you had an infinite thing that could create from nothing, increase from nothing, and never does it, is that how is that any different from something that exists that can't create? Right? How is that different from something that exists that has no power to create, if it never chooses to create? Right? If something creates, it certainly demonstrates that it can create. If it does create, right, it demonstrates that. So the verse of the Quran says that, just to kind of again reiterate, so you can think about it. Then is he who creates like one who does not create. So will you not be reminded? Now, one of the amazing things about the Quran is that one verse can be an argument and refutation for multiple audiences and different backgrounds. So this could equally apply to polytheists who worship stone statues and idols, who say, like, is the one who can create everything the same as something that can't create anything, right? Even in their theology, these stone statues couldn't make stuff, or the gods which are meant to be represented by these statues, they didn't make stuff, they just managed stuff, right? But you have the creator of the universe, and in many ancient theologies, you have this creator God. He makes everything, and then he's forgotten about. Right, the Egyptian god Ptah, the ancient Chinese god Shangdi, and so on and so forth. You have, I believe, Kronos in the Greek pantheon. Well, technically, stuff was made. He makes stuff, then gets forgotten about. But there's actually a rebellion by his sons against him, and led by Zeus. And anyway, I'm not gonna get into that, but. In all these cultures, and this when historians look at this, they're always quite amazed when you have this creator God who makes everything, makes smaller gods, and then just gets ignored by the, people pick a local smaller god to be the patron god of their city, and they just worship that god. Like Hubal might have been viewed as a patron god of the Quraysh, or some of the clans of the Quraysh, for example, or Athena. Not Zeus, but Athena, and certainly not Kronos, viewed as the patron god of Athens, named after Athena. They forget about these other gods, right? They forget about this. If you asked, I saw this. There was this Hindu politician, was a BJP member, and he basically was asked in an interview. They said it's just a friendly interview with a sympathetic interviewer, of course, and asked him his opinions about things, and he was certainly talking about Muslims in a derogatory manner. And then he was asked about his career, and then he was asked, and what God do you worship? And then he talks about some local god, whatever he worships, like a football team or something. So wait a second, what about Brahman, right? The creator of the universe. What, you're going to ignore him? Why have you forgotten Brahman, right? Anyway, so. But what's interesting in this verse of the Quran, just to go back, rewind it back a minute, is that when God's creation of the universe, first and foremost, what is it a demonstration of? Right? Think about it. Yeah. What is God's creation of the universe a demonstration of? Would anyone like to answer in the comment section? What does it demonstrate? If God creates, what does that demonstrate? He has the ability to create. And the ability to create is a demonstration of his power. Power, it means the ability to affect or to work, to do work. And of course, for God, he can do it inexhaustibly. Or this creator, we know rationally, I'm not referring to Islamic doctrine here. I'm just saying from first principles of our deduction, we know that this thing can create from nothing and increase from nothing and increase energy from nothing, so to speak. Then it certainly has inexhaustible supply. So to make everything is demonstration of his power. So everything that exists, we know is intended, is chosen, therefore has intention behind it. And if it's intended, and we know that it's made by, because its existence is a demonstration of his power, then the intention behind everything that exists simply demonstrates his power. You know this by a different terminology in the English language. You know it as a glorification of God. Everything glorifies God, or is it a evidence, or is an ayat of God, or is a glorification of God. But when you hear the word glorification, sometimes before I go to break anyway, so I'm just going to finish this point, inshallah, because the break's going to come up. But when you hear the word glorification, sometimes you might assume that glorification just means, like, oh, you're so great, you're amazing, and the universe just does that in some inaudible manner towards God, which you could argue in a way it does, but you look at it through an anthropomorphic lens. You think, I don't get it. God wants us to create things to say he's great. Like, that just sounds like stroking one's ego if a human being were to do it, right? But no, that's a very unsophisticated understanding, and also it's an assumption of what glorification means. Glorification in this manner, it's not human glory. It's not how human beings understand glorification, right? To glorify somebody means to raise them in your esteem, right? But the universe's existence as a glorification of God simply means that it evidences his power to create. It is an evidence of his power to create. It is a demonstration of his power to create. Intrinsically, that's what it is. And so that means the purpose of all things made by God is an evidence of him as the creator. And therefore there could be no other purpose behind it, no other intent behind it. I know some people might say simply, are you saying that God made us because he can? That would be a deceptively simple way of saying it, because when we understand that as a human being being arrogant to do so, right? I made it because I could, right? No. He made us because he did, right? He made us because he did. And you can't there is no first cause behind the first cause. What I mean by that is there is no motivation built on an instinctual drive that made God want to satisfy it by making us. He made us because he simply chose to make us. And you can't, he's not a finite creature that you could deduce anything. And rationality tells us it can only ever be that way. It could only ever be that way. You can't fathom it. Only that he made us as a demonstration of his ability to create, not for a demonstration of his ability to create. If that makes it, if you can understand the subtle distinction between those things. Someone says this is very important to clarify, as it is asked by many. Okay, I'll make the universe to share the benefits of existing to those who merit to worship and submit to him. Okay, so before I go into that, that will conclude stage 2 of our investigation of observable reality. The next stages are going to be much shorter because these are the bigger humps that we have to travel over. But I'll be demonstrating briefly how everything that exists, human life phenomena and everything that we can see, how that too has intention and purpose, and how there is only one revelation that explains all this without contradiction. And we're going to find out what that revelation is. Of course, well, I mean, no prize for guessing, of course, what it is. I'm not going to suddenly come out and say it's Jainism, right? But I want us to go from a basis of no assumption to building our concepts based on rational foundation. So we'll break for
everyone. So right now it is 9:24, and inshallah we want everyone. We're gonna come back at exactly 9:36. And the thing is, guys, if you know somebody that left and somebody that has any questions, this is the time to tell them to come back. I know a lot of people are thinking about the Lakers and Heat, but you already know LeBron wants it, so you don't have to worry about that, inshallah. But anyways, so we're gonna break for Isha, and we're gonna be back at 9:35, inshallah. So we hope to see everyone back, inshallah, in 10 minutes. And for all those on Zoom, you can stay. And for the questions, we'll start right after the intermission. Jazakumullah khair, and we'll be back right, inshallah, shortly.